The envelope that changed my life arrived on a frostbitten October morning. I remember standing at my mailbox, watching my breath form clouds in the autumn air as I turned the unmarked manila package over in my hands. No return address, just my name in crisp black letters that seemed to float above the paper rather than rest upon it. Inside, I found a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper bearing an address in downtown Boston and tomorrow's date, followed by words that would echo in my mind for months to come. Your unique abilities have not gone unnoticed. We have an opportunity for you. I should have thrown it away. Any reasonable person would have dismissed it as an elaborate scam or a practical joke. But I had never been reasonable, and more importantly, I had never been normal. Throughout my life, there had been incidents, moments that defied explanation, the vivid dreams of places that felt more real than reality itself, the overwhelming sense of déjà vu in locations I had never visited, and most notably, the incident from my childhood that my parents still refused to discuss when I vanished for 3 days and reappeared with no memory of where I'd been. The building proved easy enough to find, though it seemed to resist attention, my eyes wanting to slide past its unremarkable concrete facade. It sat wedged between two trendy art galleries, its windows tinted to opacity, no signs, no markings, just a sleek security panel beside a heavy steel door that opened the moment I approached. Inside, the air hummed with the gentle whir of hidden machinery. A woman in a charcoal suit greeted me by name before I could speak and led me through a maze of corridors that seemed to descend gradually, though I never noticed any stairs. We emerged into a conference room where 5 people sat waiting, 3 in military dress uniforms, 2 in civilian clothes that practically screamed government official. "Please have a seat," said a silver-haired man at the head of the table. "We have much to discuss about your unique talents." What followed was a conversation that shattered my understanding of reality. They had been watching me, they explained, monitoring unusual energy signatures that surrounded me since childhood. They called me a universe walker, though they used other terms too, speaking of dimensional resonance and consciousness transference, but they were careful to keep the explanation simple, focused on what mattered. I could do something extraordinary. I could cross between parallel realities. "Think of reality as a book," the silver-haired man said, "with infinite pages layered one atop another. Most people are bound to their page, their universe. But you can move between them, and we need that ability." The project was classified beyond top secret, they explained. The pay would be exceptional, the benefits unprecedented. They needed people like me to explore and document other realities, to gather intelligence on possible threats and opportunities that existed in parallel worlds. It sounded impossible, like something from a science fiction novel, but deep down, I knew they were right. It explained everything, all the strange occurrences in my life, all the moments of disconnection and displacement. I asked about risks. They assured me the process was safe, that they had developed technology to help control and direct my natural abilities. They spoke of success rates and safety protocols, of backup plans and emergency extractions. What they didn't mention, what I would only learn much later, were the previous universe walkers, the ones who came before me, the ones who never made it back. I signed the papers that day, multiple copies, each disappearing into unmarked folders. They gave me 72 hours to put my affairs in order, to craft a cover story for my extended absence. I told my family I had accepted a position with a research organization, something involving extensive travel. It wasn't entirely a lie. 3 days later, I reported to a nondescript private airfield outside the city. A sleek black helicopter waited on the tarmac, its rotors already spinning. As we lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness, I watched my old life shrink away below, not realizing it was the last time I would see it intact. Not understanding that with each passing moment, with each mile we covered, I was flying towards something that would consume not just my future, but my very understanding of existence itself. The training facility lay buried deep beneath the Nevada desert, a sprawling complex of laboratories and living quarters carved into the bedrock. My first week consisted of endless briefings and examinations. They mapped my brain waves, measured my biological responses to various stimuli, and subjected me to psychological evaluations that seemed designed to probe the outer limits of sanity itself. Then came the resonance chamber. The first time I saw it, I almost walked away from the whole project. It looked like something out of a nightmare, a perfect sphere suspended in the center of a vast room, its surface covered in a material that seemed to swallow light. Inside, they explained, I would learn to control my ability to traverse realities. They had designed it to help focus my natural talents, to give me conscious control over what had previously been instinctive and unpredictable. Tomorrow, my primary handler told me as we stood staring up at the sphere, you begin your real training. Tomorrow, you learn to walk between worlds. If only I had known then what that really meant. If only I had understood the true nature of what waited between those worlds, in the spaces where reality grew thin. But I was eager, ambitious, and if I'm being honest, arrogant. I thought I had been chosen for something great. I was right about being chosen. I just didn't understand what I had been chosen for. My first jump happened on a Sunday morning. I stood inside the resonance chamber, my heart pounding against my ribs as the technicians' voices crackled through hidden speakers. The air began to vibrate, filling with a soft blue light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. They had tried to prepare me for this moment, but nothing could have readied me for the actual sensation of reality coming undone. The world split apart like a kaleidoscope, fracturing into infinite possibilities. For a moment that felt like eternity, I existed everywhere and nowhere, my consciousness stretched across an impossible expanse. Then, with a sensation like plunging into ice-cold water, I snapped back into focus. I found myself standing in what appeared to be Central Park. At first glance, everything looked normal, trees swaying in the breeze, people jogging along winding paths, the Manhattan skyline rising in the distance. But small details felt wrong. The grass beneath my feet was a shade too blue, the clouds moved too quickly across the sky, and when I looked closer at the skyline, I noticed buildings that didn't exist in my New York, their architecture subtly alien. My handler's voice crackled through the small device in my ear. Confirm successful transition. I did, trying to keep my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. The mission was simple. Observe and document the differences in this reality for 1 hour, then return to the extraction point. As I walked through this almost familiar park, I noticed more discrepancies. The people wore clothes that were similar to fashion from my world, but with colors combined in ways that felt jarring. Street signs bore names that were slightly off. Madison Boulevard instead of Madison Avenue, Queen Street instead of Queens Road. Everything was just different enough to create a constant sense of unease. That first mission went perfectly. I gathered my observations, avoided interaction with the locals, and returned exactly on schedule. The transition back felt easier, like my consciousness had learned the path. The project leaders were pleased, and within days, they had me jumping again. The next few missions followed a similar pattern. I visited worlds that closely mirrored our own, each with its own subtle variations. In one, the American Revolution had failed, leaving the nation as a commonwealth with a distinctly British flavor. In another, the Industrial Revolution had taken a different turn, resulting in a society powered by steam and clockwork rather than electricity. Each jump taught me something new about the nature of reality and possibility. But then came the jump that changed everything. I materialized in what should have been downtown Philadelphia. The coordinates were exact, the transition smooth. But something was wrong. The streets were empty, not just quiet, but completely devoid of life. No people, no animals, not even insects. The buildings looked normal from a distance, but up close, their surfaces seemed to shift and ripple when viewed from the corner of my eye. The silence pressed against my eardrums like a physical force. My footsteps echoed off the buildings, each sound seeming to travel further than it should. I walked for blocks, documenting everything with the specialized camera they'd given me, trying to ignore the growing sense of wrongness that crept up my spine. Then I saw the first figure. It stood in a doorway, perfectly still, its form human but somehow wrong in proportion. When I turned to look directly at it, it remained motionless, but I could feel it watching me. I raised my hand in greeting, following protocol for unexpected contact. The figure raised its hand in response, the movement too smooth, too precise, like a reflection in a mirror. I took a step closer and it did the same. Another step, another mirror movement. When we were about 10 feet apart, it stopped. Then, slowly, its face began to change. The features remained human, but they rearranged themselves like clay being molded by invisible hands. And its eyes, they weren't eyes at all, but deep, dark voids that seemed to pull at something inside me. I broke protocol. I ran. Behind me, I heard movement, not footsteps, but a smooth, sliding sound like silk over marble. I didn't look back. I sprinted the 6 blocks to my extraction point, my lungs burning, my mind reeling. As the familiar sensation of transition began to take hold, I glanced over my shoulder. The street behind me was filled with figures, all standing perfectly still, all wearing the same twisted approximation of a human face, and all of them were staring directly at me with those impossible, void-filled eyes. I materialized in the resonance chamber, vomiting and shaking. The project leaders swarmed around me, their voices overlapping as they demanded details, measurements, readings. But all I could think about was the way those figures had moved, the way they had watched me, and most of all, the certainty I felt that they had recognized me somehow. That night, lying in my quarters beneath the desert, I had my first nightmare about the spaces between worlds. In the dream, I was back in that moment of transition, my consciousness spread across infinite realities. But this time, I wasn't alone in that impossible space. Something else was there with me, something vast and ancient, something that had been waiting for someone like me to open the door. After my encounter with the figures in that empty Philadelphia, things changed at the facility. The project leaders claimed my experience was an anomaly, a rare occurrence caused by unstable dimensional boundaries. But their actions told a different story. They increased security protocols, added new monitoring equipment to my gear, and assigned a dedicated medical team to track my physical and mental state. I should have walked away then, but the dreams had started, and with them came a compulsion I couldn't explain. Every night, I found myself back in that space between realities, and every night, I felt that presence growing closer. I became convinced that the only way to understand what was happening was to keep jumping. My next significant mission took me to a version of Los Angeles. From the moment I materialized, I knew something was different about this world. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the city, except they weren't shadows at all. Where darkness should have been, there was only an absence, like holes cut into the fabric of reality itself. People walked the streets, going about their business as if nothing was wrong. They stepped through these void-like patches without seeming to notice them. I followed a crowd into a shopping mall, trying to maintain my composure as I documented everything with my camera. The interior was brightly lit, but no one cast any shadows. Not a single person, not even me. A store clerk approached me, her movements fluid and natural. "Can I help you find anything?" she asked, her voice pleasant and normal. But when she smiled, I noticed that her teeth reflected light that didn't exist in the room. Behind her, mannequins in the store window slowly turned their heads to watch us. I made an excuse and hurried away, my heart pounding. As I moved through the mall, I began to notice other details. The people around me were acting normally, but their movements seemed synchronized somehow. When one person checked their phone, 3 others did the same. When someone laughed, the sound was echoed by voices throughout the building. Then I saw my reflection in a store window, and everything stopped. My mirror image wasn't moving with me. It stood perfectly still, staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. Its lips began to move, forming words I couldn't hear. I stepped closer, trying to understand. "They're coming through," my reflection mouthed. "Every jump makes it easier for them." The world around me suddenly went silent. I turned to find every person in the mall standing completely still, their faces turned toward me. In the distance, I heard a sound like glass cracking. The void patches where shadows should have been began to spread, eating away at the edges of reality. I ran for the extraction point, pursued by the sound of thousands of feet moving in perfect unison. Behind me, mannequins stepped out of their window displays. My reflection appeared in every surface I passed. Windows, mirrors, polished floors, each one trying to warn me of something I couldn't quite understand. I made it back, but something followed me through. In the debriefing, while I was describing what happened, every screen in the room briefly showed my reflection, still mouthing those same words. The project leaders pretended not to notice, but I saw the fear in their eyes. That night, for the first time, I broke into the facility's secure archives. What I found confirmed my worst fears. Reports dating back decades detailed similar experiences from other universe walkers. They all described the same progression. First the dreams, then the anomalies, then the reflections trying to warn them, and finally the disappearances. The reports ended the same way every time. The universe walker in question would begin experiencing temporal displacement and identity distortion. They would report seeing themselves in other realities, claim that their memories were becoming confused between worlds. Then, inevitably, they would vanish during a jump, only to be replaced by a version of themselves from another reality. The most disturbing part, according to the files, I wasn't the first version of myself to work for the project. I was the fourth. The previous three had all disappeared into parallel worlds, leaving only their reports behind. As I read through the files, the lights in the archive room began to flicker. In the darkness between each flash, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Something was taking shape in the shadows, something that had followed me back from that shadowless world. I ran back to my quarters, but I couldn't escape the feeling that I had crossed some invisible line. The boundaries between realities were starting to blur, and now something was bleeding through, something that had been waiting for this moment, using the universe walkers to slowly wear down the walls between worlds. The discovery that I was the fourth version of myself shattered what remained of my reality. I spent that night in my quarters, comparing my own memories to the reports left by my predecessors. Small details began to feel wrong, memories that didn't quite fit, experiences that felt borrowed rather than lived. Had I always been afraid of deep water? Or was that a trait from version 2? Did I really grow up in Boston, or was that version 1's life I was remembering? But I couldn't stop jumping. Despite the horror of what I'd discovered, something compelled me to continue. Maybe it was the need to understand what had happened to the other versions of me. Maybe it was the growing certainty that if I stopped, something worse would happen. My next assignment sent me to a world that seemed perfect at first glance. I emerged in a small town in Maine, where autumn had painted the trees in brilliant shades of red and gold. People walked their dogs, children played in leaf piles, and everything appeared wonderfully normal. Then I noticed how none of the leaves ever hit the ground. They fell from the trees in endless spirals, dancing on invisible currents of air, but never landing. I watched one leaf for nearly 10 minutes as it spun and twirled, always stopping just inches above the earth before rising again. The people around me acted as if this was perfectly natural. When I looked closer, I realized they were all smiling. Not just some of them, every single person wore the exact same peaceful, contented expression. A little girl approached me, her smile as fixed as all the others. "Are you here to join us?" she asked, her voice carrying undertones that reminded me of radio static. "The gentle ones say, we're almost ready." I asked her who the gentle ones were. Her smile widened impossibly, stretching beyond the natural limits of her face. "They live in the spaces you travel through," she said. "They've been watching you, all of you, every version. They say you're helping them make the walls thinner." Behind her, I noticed other townspeople had stopped to watch us. Their smiles had grown to match hers, their faces distorting to accommodate the impossible expressions. The falling leaves began to move faster, their endless spiral turning violent. "Would you like to meet them?" the girl asked. Her eyes had started to change, the pupils expanding like drops of ink in water. "They're so close now. Every jump brings them nearer. Every crossing makes it easier for them to reach through." I broke into a run. The townspeople didn't chase me, but when I looked back, I saw them all standing in perfect rows, their grotesque smiles aimed at the sky. The leaves had formed a cyclone above them, and in the spaces between the swirling colors, I caught glimpses of something moving, something vast. The extraction point was in a clearing just outside the town. As I waited for the jump sequence to initiate, the little girl's words kept echoing in my mind. The walls were getting thinner. Every jump made it easier for something to break through. When I returned to the facility, things had changed again. New security doors had been installed, their surfaces covered in strange symbols that hurt my eyes if I looked at them too long. The project leaders had been replaced by people I'd never seen before, but who claimed to have been there all along. That night, I received an unmarked envelope under my door. Inside was a handwritten note that I instantly recognized as my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it. The message was simple: find the others, we're still here. The gaps between worlds lead somewhere. They're not what you think. I spent hours examining the security footage of the corridor outside my room, but there was no sign of anyone delivering the note. What I did notice was more disturbing. In every frame of the video, my reflection in the polished floor moved independently of my actual movements. It was trying to tell me something. I needed answers. The next morning, I volunteered for a high-risk jump to a reality we had previously marked as unstable. The project leaders seemed almost eager to approve the mission, their eyes glinting with an anticipation that made me wonder whose side they were really on. The jump took me to a world where time itself had begun to unravel. I materialized in what had once been a major city, though it was impossible to tell which one. The buildings curved in ways that ignored physics, their architectures bleeding into one another like wet paint. The sky above was a kaleidoscope of different times of day, sunset and midnight and dawn all happening simultaneously. And there, standing in the midst of this chaos, I found another version of myself. Not one of the three who had come before me in my reality, but a different variation. She stood before a makeshift memorial wall covered in photographs, hundreds of them, all showing different versions of us from different realities. "You're finally here," she said without turning around. "I've been waiting. We all have. There's something you need to understand about what we really are, about what they're using us for." She turned to face me, and I saw that her eyes held the same void-like quality I'd seen in that first Philadelphia mission. But now, looking into that darkness, I began to understand what it really meant. My other self led me through the twisted city, past buildings that folded in on themselves like origami crafted from reality itself. The air shimmered with after-images of events that hadn't happened yet, or perhaps had already occurred thousands of times. "We're not traveling between parallel worlds," she explained as we walked. "That's what they want us to believe, but it's a lie. These aren't separate realities. They're fragments of a single universe that's being torn apart, and we're not explorers, we're bait." She stopped at what looked like a normal door standing alone in the middle of an empty lot. Around it, reality rippled like heat waves off hot asphalt. Every time we jump, we create new cracks in the walls of our universe. Small at first, barely noticeable, but they're getting bigger, and something has noticed. She opened the door, revealing not a room but a vast, dark space filled with floating images, countless versions of our world seen from impossible angles. The government didn't discover our ability to traverse realities. They were given the technology, given it by something that's been waiting, watching, preparing, something that needs our universe to break apart. In the darkness beyond the door, shapes moved that hurt my mind to look at. Not because they were grotesque or alien, but because they seemed to exist in more directions than reality should allow. They flowed through spaces that weren't there, bent around corners that couldn't exist. "The entities that live between realities," my other self continued. "They don't want to invade our world. They want to digest it, break it down into smaller and smaller pieces until the boundaries between what is and what isn't become so blurred that they can absorb everything into their own impossible realm." As if to emphasize her point, a building in the distance suddenly folded inward, its structure collapsing into a point of darkness that shouldn't have been able to exist. The darkness pulsed once, then vanished, taking with it a sphere of reality about 3 blocks wide. What remained looked like a wound in the world, its edges raw and ragged. "Every universe walker they recruit is carefully chosen," she said. "We all have something in common, a moment in our childhood when we first brushed against the space between spaces. For me, it was a near-death experience in a swimming pool. For another version of us, it was a high fever that lasted 7 days. For you." The 3 days I disappeared, I finished, memories suddenly clicking into place. I always thought I had just wandered off, gotten lost somehow. She nodded. That contact marked us, changed us, made us perfect for their purpose. We can survive the transition between realities because we're already partially disconnected from normal space-time. And every time we jump, we carry a little more of their influence back with us. A sound like distant thunder rolled across the broken city. Above us, the fractured sky began to pulse with light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My other self grabbed my arm, her expression urgent. "They're preparing for the final phase," she said. "In every reality, they've been gathering versions of us, using our jumps to weaken the structural integrity of space-time. And now the walls are almost thin enough." "But why?" I asked. "Why choose us? Why maintain this elaborate government program if they could just break through on their own?" Her laugh was bitter. "Because they can't. They need us to do it willingly, need us to keep jumping, keep creating new cracks, keep believing we're doing something important. Free will, consciousness, it's the only force they can't directly manipulate. That's why they need the government as a front, need us to choose to participate." Another building collapsed into nothingness nearby, the void it left behind larger than the last. The thunder sound grew closer, and with it came a vibration that seemed to resonate with something deep inside my bones. "The project leaders," I said, remembering their eager expressions when I volunteered for this jump. "They know, don't they? They're working with these entities." "Some of them are," she replied. "Others have been replaced. Look closely at their eyes next time you see them. Really look. You'll notice they don't reflect light quite right anymore." The vibration was becoming unbearable now, making it hard to think. In the distance, more buildings were collapsing, the voids they left behind beginning to merge into larger patches of nothingness. The edges of reality were starting to fray. "Listen carefully," my other self said, her voice taking on a desperate edge. "There's a way to stop this, but I need you to." She never finished the sentence. A wave of darkness swept through the city like a tide, consuming everything in its path. The last thing I saw was her face, calm despite everything, as she pushed me backward through a doorway that hadn't been there a moment before. I materialized in the resonance chamber with the taste of ash in my mouth and the echoes of vanished realities burning behind my eyes. The monitoring team rushed forward with their usual instruments and questions, but I barely heard them. I was too busy watching their eyes, really watching them, just as my other self had told me to do. Most of the technicians seemed normal, their eyes reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights of the chamber as expected. But the project leaders who stood at the back of the room, their eyes absorbed light like bottomless pools. Even when they stepped directly under the bright overhead lamps, no light bounced back. I wondered how I had never noticed it before. "Remarkable readings from this jump," one of them said, their voice carrying that same undertone of static I'd heard in the little girl's voice from the town of endless falling leaves. "We'd like to schedule another expedition immediately. The barriers between realities seem particularly permeable today." Of course they did. They wanted to send me out again, wanted me to crack their universe a little more. Each jump was like striking a hammer against reality, creating tiny fractures that their masters could exploit. How many other universe walkers were out there right now, jumping between worlds, unknowingly helping to shatter existence itself? I made an excuse about fatigue and retreated to my quarters. They didn't try to stop me. They wanted me to believe I still had control, still had choices. But as I walked through the facility's corridors, I began to notice things I'd been blind to before. The new security doors weren't designed to keep anything out. The symbols carved into their surface were more like welcome mats, inviting something in. The endless monitoring equipment wasn't measuring my jumps. It was measuring the deterioration of reality around the facility. Even the resonance chamber itself, with its light-absorbing surface, wasn't just a tool for focusing my abilities. It was a beacon, broadcasting our location across the spaces between spaces. In my room, I found another note had been slipped under my door. Same handwriting as before. My handwriting, but the paper felt wrong, like it had been manufactured in a world where the laws of physics worked slightly differently. The message was longer this time. By now you know the truth. The other versions of us have been trying to warn you, trying to break through the conditioning they use to keep us compliant. The facility isn't just in our world. It exists simultaneously across multiple realities, each one centered on a different version of us. Some versions figured it out sooner than others. Some tried to stop it. Most disappeared trying. But we found something they don't want us to know. The space between realities isn't empty. It's not just a void where their kind lives. It's the remnants of the original universe, the one they broke apart eons ago. And somewhere in there, in the depths between worlds, there's a point where everything connects. A place where reality first started to fracture. If someone could reach that point, if they could understand what happened there, maybe the damage could be undone, but they watch us too closely, monitor our jumps, control where we can go. The only way to reach it would be to break free from their network entirely, to jump blind. The note ended there, but a string of coordinates followed, written in a shaky hand that suggested whoever wrote them was fighting against something that didn't want these numbers recorded. I knew what a blind jump meant. No safety protocols, no quantum anchor to guide me back, no guarantee I'd end up anywhere at all. The chances of survival were almost non-existent. But then again, if I was right about what was happening, survival might not be the most important thing anymore. A soft tapping sound drew my attention to the small window in my room. My reflection stared back at me, but while I sat on my bed, it stood upright, pressing its hand against its side of the glass. Behind it, I could see other versions of myself stretching away into infinity. All of them had the same desperate look in their eyes. All of them were nodding. The facility's alarms began to blare, the sound distorting in a way that made my teeth ache. They knew. Somehow, they knew I'd figured it out. Heavy footsteps approached my door, accompanied by that now familiar static sound that meant the things wearing human shapes were coming for me. I had seconds to make my decision. The coordinates burned in my mind like a brand. I could feel the space between realities calling to me, but this time, it wasn't their call I was hearing. It was something older, something that remembered when reality was whole. My door began to crack open, revealing darkness where there should have been light from the corridor. As shadows that moved wrong began to seep into my room, I made my choice. I closed my eyes, focused on those coordinates, and prepared to make one final jump. The blind jump felt different from any transition I'd experienced before. Without the quantum anchor or the resonance chamber's guidance, I was fully exposed to the raw chaos of interdimensional space. It felt like being torn apart and reassembled 1,000 times per second, each iteration slightly different from the last. I saw things in that chaos, fragments of other jumps, other attempts, bodies frozen in the void, their faces twisted in eternal screams, failed versions of myself who had tried to make this same journey, now suspended forever in the space between spaces. But I also saw something else. Paths through the madness, marked by faint traces of those who had gone before, successful attempts. The coordinates pulled me deeper, beyond the layers of reality I'd previously explored. I passed through worlds in various stages of consumption, some just beginning to fray around the edges, others almost completely devoured, reduced to islands of matter floating in an endless void. In one, I glimpsed a version of our facility, its walls peeled open like a flower, with something massive and dark nesting within. Finally, after what felt like years compressed into seconds, I reached the coordinates. The space around me stabilized, though space wasn't quite the right word for where I found myself. I stood in what appeared to be a vast library, its shelves stretching infinitely in all directions. But instead of books, the shelves held moments, fragments of time and space suspended like insects in amber. "You made it," a voice said behind me. "More of us are starting to break free, starting to find their way here." I turned to find another version of myself, but different from any I'd seen before. Her form seemed to shift and change as if she existed in multiple states simultaneously. Around her, reality itself appeared more stable, more solid. "Welcome to the archive," she said. "The place where it all started, where they first broke into our universe and began their work." She led me down an aisle, gesturing to the fragments on the shelves. Each one contained a piece of history, not just from our world, but from all possible worlds. This was their first victory, she explained. The original universe was too stable, too resilient for them to consume, so they fractured it, created infinite variations, each one slightly weaker than the last. They've been feeding on these fragments ever since, slowly working their way toward the prime reality. The government program, I asked. Just their latest method of weakening the walls. Before that, it was wars. Before that, plagues. Anything that would cause reality to buckle under the weight of possibility. But they're getting desperate now. The fragments are running out, and they haven't been able to reach the prime reality, the one place where they could start the cycle over again. She stopped at a particular shelf, reaching out to touch one of the fragments. The moment she made contact, the air around us filled with images. The first universe walker, the first successful jump, the beginning of the fractures. But they made a mistake, she continued. They never understood what they were really breaking apart. Reality isn't just space and time, it's consciousness, awareness, choice. By shattering the universe, they created infinite versions of everyone, including us, and now those infinite versions are starting to remember, starting to work together. A distant sound echoed through the archive, like the roar of collapsing buildings multiplied 1,000-fold. The entities had noticed my blind jump, noticed me finding this place. They were coming. "We don't have much time," my other self said, "but I can show you what needs to be done. Every version of us that makes it here adds to our understanding, our ability to fight back. Some realities are already beginning to heal, to stitch themselves back together." The roaring grew louder. Through the infinite aisles of the archive, I could see darkness beginning to spread, consuming the fragments on the shelves. The entities weren't just coming, they were trying to destroy this place, erase the evidence of what they'd done. "Take my hand," the shifting version of myself said. "I'll show you what they don't want us to see, what really exists in the space between spaces." As our hands touched, understanding flooded through me. I saw the truth about our universe, about consciousness, about reality itself. I saw how to begin healing the fractures, how to reconnect the fragments, but most importantly, I saw that I wasn't alone. Every version of myself that had made it here had added to the resistance, had learned a little more about how to fight back. The darkness was almost upon us now, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I knew what needed to be done. The entities had broken reality apart, but they couldn't break the connections between consciousness. Every universe walker they recruited, every version of ourselves they used, only added to the network of awareness that was slowly beginning to remember it was once whole. I looked at my other self and nodded. Together, we turned to face the approaching darkness. We had work to do. Reality needed to be reminded of what it once was, and this time, we were ready. This time, we would be the ones doing the breaking, not of worlds, but of the barriers they had placed in our minds. The archive trembled as the entities closed in, but they were too late. The knowledge was already spreading, passing from version to version, world to world. They had taught us to walk between realities, and now we would use that knowledge to undo everything they had done. I closed my eyes and prepared for one final jump, not away from the darkness, but into it. Sometimes the only way to heal something broken is to break it one last time, in just the right way, and this time, I knew exactly where the cracks needed to be.